Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Several articles to go over today. This is im1776.com. Article by Orrin McIntyre, Popular Sovereignty Convoy. Canadian truckers are exposing our government's vulnerabilities. There are many Western countries that have placed previously unthinkable restrictions on their citizens in the wake of the COVID pandemic, but Canada has been particularly cruel. In Quebec, unvaccinated people are not allowed to shop in common retail stores unless accompanied by a health monitor to ensure they only purchase food and medicine before being escorted out. Canadians are charged a special tax due to their vaccination status and banned from places like restaurants and liquor stores. I think this special tax is only in Quebec, but yes, in Quebec, the restrictions are particularly cruel. In face of these tyrannical restrictions, the first sign of real resistance has come from an unlikely place: Canada's truckers. These essential workers formed what has been dubbed a freedom convoy, traveling toward the nation's capital, now as you know, in the nation's capital, to protest the newest round of vaccine mandates targeting truck drivers. Millions of dollars have been raised in support of the convoy, including a generous donation by Elon Musk, as you might have seen, and over 50,000 truckers have descended on the city despite the sub-zero temperatures. Those of you who haven't seen, Elon Musk donated, what did he donate? 42,600, and also gave a redirect to liar.com, which you can go have a look at. In response to the popular outcry, Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who called the protesters a fringe minority holding unacceptable views, has reportedly fled his home in Ottawa, along with his family, to a secure and undisclosed location. Left-wing news outlets have already joined politicians in warning that the trucker convoy may be full of the usual boogeymen, racists, extremists, white nationalists, etc. The narrative for a crackdown on the protest is clearly being laid, and in one province, the necessary legal action has already been taken. In Nova Scotia, the government has cited its powers under the COVID state of emergency that was declared back in March 2020 in order to functionally ban the protest and criminalize supporting it. Those who finance, aid, or participate in the convoy, along with those who line the road to show support, will face a fine of up to $10,000. It's stunning to watch the loudest advocates of liberal democracy rush forward to crush any protest against their new biomedical security state. The same people who deliver endless tirades about the danger our fragile system faces from the looming threat of authoritarianism never hesitate to wield the new powers seized by them during the pandemic to crush their foes. It seems that democracy is so sacred that governments must ban the working class from protesting, lest they engender the delicate system of popular sovereignty. The rush by the commentariat to link the convoy to the favorite villains of the American press, racist, misogynists, and all of that, also speaks volumes. The Australian media tried a similar tactic during an outbreak of protests against lockdowns last year, smearing the popular outcry against the government as a movement of far-right extremists. It seems that no matter what Western country is facing populist opposition to the radical expansion of state power, the narrative remains the same. Pandemic-related protest restrictions across the West are nakedly political, and this has laid bare the rot at the heart of so many governments that claim the will of the people as the source of their legitimacy. As lockdowns became the norm at the beginning of the pandemic in the United States, large businesses were allowed to stay open, while churches, gyms, schools, and family-owned stores were forced to close down. Pastors were arrested for holding services, and protesters were arrested for singing hymns outside in defiance of the regulations. Then the death of George Floyd was caught on camera, and the burning and looting of American cities became the highest moral priority. The same Americans who had been forced to shutter their businesses for months as they went bankrupt now had to watch as violent mobs emptied those businesses and burned them to the ground. Health experts who had warned that the smallest family gathering could turn into a super spreader event enthusiastically endorsed massive street protests. Biden's supporters were allowed to drink champagne maskless in the streets, while people with the wrong politics were required to hold funerals for their loved ones over Zoom. Some Trump supporters took this to mean that the rules for street protests had been suspended in the United States, But on January 6th, they quickly learned that political allegiance is now the determining factor when it came to the application of the law. As regimes across the West engage in an arms race to see how much power they can exercise over their citizenry in the name of COVID, it has become increasingly obvious that the freedom to assemble is a privilege handed to the loyal, not a right afforded to free citizens. The fact that a doctrine of individual rights, liberal democracy, and constitutional government has in no way inhibited the dynamic expansion of government power in Western countries should give pause to those who have assumed these as shared values. It's clear that these words have become shibboleths stripped of any real meaning. The phrases are used as hollowed out relics of a civic religion that once animated our civilization, but can now only be worn as a skin suit by those hoping to use the last bit of shared cultural fabric to herd their populations into the new security state that has been fashioned for them. Still, the caravan of Canadian truckers reveals a serious flaw in the plans our ruling elites have laid out for their brave new world. The professional managerial class that rules over much of the West built their power on technology and propaganda. Their loyal followers make up the staff of the universities, newsrooms, corporate HR offices, and public schools. They're the party of the laptop class, ruling through the manipulation of procedure and information. Automating away the working class is their eventual goal, but for now they're heavily reliant on exactly that class to keep the already fragile infrastructure of their regimes running. They've attempted to abandon the working class before they can make them obsolete. And that is a serious tactical error. Reading I Am 1776, Popular Sovereignty Convoy by Orrin McIntyre. Transportation seems to be a particular vulnerability for these regimes. In October, Southwest Airlines was forced to withdraw a planned vaccine mandate for their employees after a wildcat strike forced the company to cancel hundreds of flights. Southwest simply could not figure out how to operate their company while enforcing the looming government mandate, and one coordinated action by their employees brought them to their knees. Despite their counter-revolutionary zeal, the attempts by governments to enforce the restrictions have been arrogant and sloppy. The weight of propaganda and some clumsy legal restrictions were expected to do the job, and the ruling class had no plan to handle collective action from essential workers. And I'll add here, editorializing, that they're completely unequipped to deal with collective action from essential workers. It's not just that they have no plan, but when they're faced with collective action, they double down on their own arrogance and derision towards the people. The fact that both the trucker caravan and the Southwest strike took place with little to no support from either of the country's political parties is important to note. In the past, the left would have been desperate to portray their party as the champion of the working class, fighting for the rights of organized labor. Now, they're the ones looking to crush any opposition to the COVID mandates. You would expect the right to swiftly move to adopt a valuable voting bloc that is now politically homeless. But in both America and Canada, the Conservatives have remained largely on the sidelines. Huge missed opportunity for all the political parties. In Canada, we have some exceptions, but not among the mainstream parties. Maxime Bernier of the People's Party of Canada has been shoulder to shoulder with the protesters throughout the pandemic. But for sure, the mainstream Conservatives, as well as the mainstream so-called New Democratic Party, completely abandoned the actual working class with all kinds of ideological slogans that just are obnoxious, insulting, and way off the mark. In many ways, this is a positive aspect of the movement. It remains organic and independent instead of being co-opted by cynical party politics. The organic nature of the movement is currently an asset, but the idea of the purely popular revolution, political or otherwise, is a myth. Eventually, leadership is required to coalesce that energy into a movement that can build and maintain power. Let me just say here about the Canadian Conservatives. There are, even within the mainstream Conservative Party, exceptions, and those are worth noting. Aaron O'Toole has been not particularly helpful, as some other Conservatives also have been. What's the name? This guy's name is right on the tip of my tongue. You guys can put it in the chat. You know who I mean. The best of Canada's Conservatives. I don't know why right at the moment his name is escaping me. Probably the coffee hasn't kicked in yet. I'll get that for you in just a second. Populist movements in both Canada and the United States have seen firsthand that their governments are willing to build a two-tier society, very much so, reserving political rights only for those that demonstrate sufficient loyalty. Yeah. Unfortunately, protests often serve only as a pressure release valve for dissent, but modern technocratic governments face a real vulnerability in their fragile and aging infrastructures. That is where workers today have a real fighting chance to stand up and be heard. Orrin McIntyre, IM 1776. Give me a minute. I absolutely can't believe that I had a blank on the name of the person I'm thinking of, who's been outstanding. My goodness. Someone just throw the name there in the chat. You know who I mean. Pierre Poilievre. Sorry. Took me a moment there. He's been outstanding, and he's been shoulder to shoulder, and he's been giving the best speeches in Canada's Parliament. He's been one of the noteworthy conservatives, but the rest of them have not been as good, and definitely have not been taking advantage of the obvious opportunity here to not just the political opportunity of gaining support among the working class, but actually to address an important national crisis from a point of view of moral legitimacy and on the good foundation of our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and basically a hugely missed opportunity. And Justin Trudeau, as all of you know who have been paying attention, is just doubling down on his divisive rhetoric, which is amazing because he's the one accusing the protesters of being divisive, whereas, as we know, he's the one pitting Canadians against one another, and just, you couldn't expect anything else from him. That was very predictable. Okay, a couple of other arguments here. Let's go to this one. Let me just get it for you up on screen nicely. This is Boomers Meet the Based, published in American Mind, written by Glenn Elmers, who's got a book out on Harry Jaffa, student of Leo Strauss's, and Josiah Lippincott. How's that? Good? Yeah. By the way, good morning. Good to be with you. So much going on in the world for us to be discussing, analyzing, examining. Let's go with this. Boomers versus the based. There's a generation gap on the right, and it's hurting us. Divide and conquer is the guiding strategy of the woke oligarchy. The regime is trying to marginalize Red America as illegitimate, to separate us from the mainstream, and thus declare us undeserving of the rights and privileges of citizenship. But beyond that, the woke regime is also exploiting a generation gap on the right, which is partly but not wholly a factor of age, through doublespeak and mixed messages. Contrary to some prejudices among the younger right, not every self-identified conservative over 50 is deluded and useless. Likewise, older conservatives need to know that not every young right-wing provocateur on Twitter is a racist anarchist. By the way, those of you who don't know and who don't follow, to a certain extent, I think, Glenn probably on the boomer side, Lippincott probably on the based side, and a nice alliance here of American Mind style Straussians, people on the right who are willing to entertain, like Mike Anton, for example. They have both a solid footing in old school conservatism and its main sources, as well as some sympathy for the new anti-liberal right, or the new non-mainstream or quote-unquote based right. Contrary to some prejudices among the younger right, not every self-identified conservative over 50 is deluded and useless. Likewise, older conservatives need to know that not every young right-wing Twitter provocateur on Twitter is a racist anarchist. One more little aside here. There are a lot of good right-wing provocateurs on Twitter, and I don't just mean, actually, I don't at all mean the people who do the obnoxious posting, like tasteless and tactless, but a lot of good young academic adjacent type right-wing posters on Twitter, and you can actually learn something from their spaces, from following them, from reading the books that they recommend and things like that. And for sure, they're not all racist anarchists. In fact, I doubt that any of them are. But a lot of people on either side see each other that way, largely because the regime's vast propaganda machine is able to reinforce both of these prejudices. So one debate that you can look at if you want to see what the younger right looks like in the eyes of boomer conservatism, check out what C. Bradley Thompson has written about the Pajama Boy Nietzscheans in American Mind, AmericanMind.org, what he's written against Bronze Age pervert and his followers, and you'll get kind of a sense of that divide. It's hard to know whether this multi-pronged media campaign by the left is a carefully planned psyops strategy or just the net effect of simultaneously asserting contradictory arguments depending on whatever seems expedient. Either way, a generation gap on the right is being exacerbated, in part because each side is reacting to the blue regime's propaganda. Just another little editorial aside here before we return to the essay. To a certain extent, the boomer conservatism or this old school or old age conservatism is structured by the post-war world in a way that the young right is not. So this, liberal, the zealous liberal conservatism that guards against the threats of communism and fascism on one hand, versus the post-liberal conservatism that's reacting to new, absolutely new configuration, new state of affairs. That's another way of looking at this, maybe. I'm sure they'll say something like that here. The older generation grew up in an America where on the surface institutions were trustworthy, or at the very least not actively at war with the people. That facade crumbled for those who grew up after 9/11. Decades of pointless war in the Middle East, the financial crisis in which not a single banker on Wall Street went to jail, and the ever skyrocketing cost of living soured the generation that grew up under George W. Bush and Barack Obama. All things that you have to take into account: life after 9/11, wars in the Middle East, financial crisis with no accountability. The promise of racial reconciliation never materialized, and the constant screams of crisis, climate change, COVID, have further radicalized a growing youth faction on the right. I like American Mind, AmericanMind.org. They're willing to take up perspectives that are vital and vitally important, but that can be ignored in other presses. I Am 1776 that we looked at earlier, also a great publication you should have your eyes on. Young people get almost all their news online, which gives them a broad array of information sources and makes them far less likely to accept any official narratives. At times, they may almost be too skeptical, embracing odd and outlandish theories simply because they're outside the mainstream. Insisting that the sky is pink just because Ibram Kendi says it's blue is not a sign of independent thinking. Americans over 50 tend to be less active on social media, less frequent consumers of alternative news sites, and more dependent on the legacy media of newspapers and TV networks. Of course, many older conservatives know that the establishment media is heavily skewed to the left, yet the publications they turn to correct this imbalance are, let us say, rather tame and conventional. Looks like Wall Street Journal and National Review. As far as the younger dissident right is concerned, most old-line conservative publications are part of the same corrupt media establishment. The more staid and authoritative style of the New York Times and the network news, which the Times heavily influences, tends to reinforce the boomers' inclination to believe that our institutions are still functioning normally and the system is working. Our political gerontocracy contributes to this problem. Nothing makes a boomer feel young like seeing Congress run by people in their 80s. News stories that create enormous controversy online often get much less attention in the legacy media. Thus, conservatives among the older generation may have little familiarity with the details of events and scandals that lead millennials to be alarmed and cynical. You know, if you're on Twitter, you have instant access to every scandal, many of which will never make any waves in the legacy media. The treatment of those arrested in connection with January 6th is a good example. Right-wingers under 40 tend to know much more about the mistreatment of these prisoners, perhaps because they're reading Revolver.news and Darren Beatty's great work, and I think Julia Kelly is the name of somebody who's been doing great work on behalf of the prisoners and spotlighting their mistreatment, and thus tend to be more sympathetic compared to conservatives over 50 who were alarmed and repelled by the events of January 6th, people like Bill Kristol, and thus are usually much less concerned with or attentive to those who have been arrested. When a clear case of left-wing excess does leak into the mainstream news, about critical race theory being taught in schools, for example, the legacy media will quickly offer an authoritative source to deny or downplay the revelations. This tactic works up to a point for those with more limited access to alternative news sources, but it only hardens the disgust and skepticism of those who are mostly online, who quickly learn about the dishonesty and hypocrisy of such denials. What the boomers need to know about the based. Good morning to those of you who are here. Good to be with you. Nice to see you. Hold on a second here. Matthew writes, the boomer right is totally sterile, incapable of generating any culture or viable way forward. Also asks, can we use the term post-liberal versus anti-liberal? Yes, possibly. Logos, hello. Hello to you too. The Canadian Tories are addressing an earlier article, are spineless idiots who became obsolete the moment that Harper left politics. Yeah, there's still hope with people like Pierre Poilievre. And yeah, that's right. In the chat from earlier. Anyhow, again, thanks for being here. Let's go back to this. So what the boomers need to know about the based. Let's clear up a few of the most common questions or suspicions older conservatives have about the so-called dissident right. Do you hate America and want it to fail? A lot of younger right-wingers will say, yes, in a certain sense they do, and they have reason for saying that. What young man with any sense wants to die for the Joe Biden regime in the Ukraine? Who wants to pay taxes so Kamala Harris can shower money on illegal immigrants and left-wing shock troops? That's a hard message to hear for anyone who lived through the 1960s and the Cold War. For a long time, to be on the right, to defend liberty and morality and decency, meant to be a patriot and to love America. And it still does, but the enemies of freedom and decency who hate America are no longer godless communists abroad. They are the godless leftists at home who are currently in power. If America means transgender rights and suffocating biomedical security measures, then those who love freedom will come to hate America. Or to be more specific, the current regime that has taken control of what used to be America. Yeah, they're going to see themselves as occupied by a illegitimate ruling class. They're going to hate that ruling class. They're going to hate everything that that ruling class has instituted. And out of a love for the America that underlies, that is underneath all of that godless leftism, they're going to want to clear away what's been built on top of it and set the true America free. In other words, they are going to hate the current regime that's taken control of what used to be America and try to restore or revitalize what America used to be, or to recreate or to found anew an America for the future. Young people on the right don't hate liberty, going back to the article, and morality and decency. They despise woke ideology. Very true. The older idea of America that the boomers love is gone as far as the younger generation is concerned. Most boomers will never share this antipathy, but they must learn to distinguish between America the nation and America the state. The American state, as the COVID lockdowns, Russiagate hoax, and political prosecution of the January 6th protesters show, is at war with the American people. Many older conservatives recognized this distinction and gave Rush Limbaugh a pass when he famously remarked on air that he hoped Barack Obama would fail. Okay, this is important. So if you had this question, if you know a boomer who has a question about the dissident right, do you hate America and want it to fail? Or, sometimes you see some members of the dissident right or some members of the young based right being attracted to regimes that typically you might have considered anti-American, like Eastern European regimes and things like that. And you might draw the conclusion, well, you must hate America. I think William Crystal, recently posted on Twitter that Tucker Carlson hates America. I think that was his whole post. Tucker Carlson hates America. Because Carlson was expressing some sympathy with what you could call, let's say, Russian anti-wokeism or Russian anti-Americanism, taking America as identical with the woke ideology. So he literally posted, Tucker Carlson hates America. Well, Carlson is one of the people that is, let's say, doing outreach to the dissident right or being a spokesperson to a certain extent for the positions of the dissident right. And what we see here is that it's not about hating America. It's about hating the woke ideology that has taken America over. I think that's clear, but it's a nice statement of it. What's with all the vulgar humor and symbolism? Okay, you might ask that, because if you have any exposure to the dissident right, which I assume that many of you, but maybe not all of you do, there's vulgar humor and symbolism. And you could wonder what's up with all of that. Young men full of spirit and life don't want to be screeched at by the shamans and witches of the ruling class. The authoritative piety of our time, anti-racism, reeks of the worst excesses of cultish fanaticism. Very true. I mean, the anti-racists see white supremacy everywhere, at everything that they look at. And they can look at the Freedom Convoy, Canada's trucker movement that you've seen in Ottawa, and maybe there would be, imagine a situation where they look and there's not a single white person in the crowd, and they would still say this is white supremacy. So it's absolutely a cultish fanaticism. The young men of the right can't help but mock these mindless dogmatists, and very much tempted to say rightfully so. A school marmish concern with civility, feelings, and hateful rhetoric will never convince young men to abandon a life of freedom in thought and action. Political correctness about race and ethnicity smacks of self-righteousness and hypocrisy. And again, we're talking about the cultish fanaticism. It's not a denial of this, that, and the other thing. We're talking about the excessive cultish fanaticism, the obvious self-righteousness and hypocrisy and stupidity and arrogance, blindness. Younger people were born into an America that has no racist laws, that offers racial preferences in hiring and education, and which has elevated figures from the civil rights movement to the level of secular saints. Not just figures from the civil rights movement, but I think to a certain extent George Floyd has been made a secular saint. You get the idea. The idea that the Ku Klux Klan or the American Nazi Party are a major threat to anyone today is rightly seen as hysterical nonsense. Today's youth mock the shibboleths of the regime as a provocation, and they see the growth of the biomedical security state suppressing dissent in the name of quote-unquote health as a far more pressing threat to liberty. So the vulgar humor and symbolism is a mockery of the cultish fanaticism of mindless dogmatists. What's the weird obsession with weightlifting, aesthetics, physiognomy, etc.? Again, any of you who have been on right-wing Twitter, you know that there are people talking about weightlifting, bodybuilding, beautiful art, marble statues, architecture, contrasting the beautiful with the ugly, physiognomy, so pointing out faces of people who look like they're low-born, low-class, fat, slovenly, and all of that. What's with the weird obsession? The boomer might ask. That the body and mind are connected is a radical statement in a world where a man can claim to be a woman because his spirit is quote-unquote actually female. The body reveals the soul. You couldn't imagine an ugly God. The youth movement on the right has turned towards self-overcoming and a love of beauty and physical improvement to spite the left-wing despisers of the body. America's left-wing corporations and culture want people to be fat, slow, and stupid. The youth on the right are therefore zagging where the left wants them to zig. The instincts are more important than the ideas. The youth movement, at least in this regard, is Nietzschean, turning against what they regard as the Socratic word factory of facts and logic. Now, I think here, one of the qualms that you could have with the youthful right, granting them everything that they get right, is that in having recourse to Nietzsche against Socrates, it gives us two important alternatives. Number one, the Socratic alternative. So is it right? I mean, Socrates also had something to say about exercise, beauty, and all of that. Even though he himself was notoriously physically ugly, still he very much defends beauty as well as exercise, harmony, gymnastics, and all of that. So would want to see something like a decent recovery of Socrates on the base right, and there are people doing that, especially the Straussian Twitter circles, as well as those of you who have followed my work at all know that, in my view, we need to take seriously a Heideggerian right. So if we just stop with Nietzsche, we're lopping off two potential alternatives, the Socratic and the Heideggerian. But that's an aside. No problem here with the defense of beauty, harmony, order, and all of that. The youth movement, at least in this regard, is Nietzschean, turning against what they regard as the Socratic word factory of facts and logic. In the spiritual war against ugliness and decline, they see mockery and fighting spirit as much better weapons. And just another little reference here. Some of you may know Roger Scruton on the importance of beauty. I thank my friend Michael Michaelidis from the YouTube channel Ancient Greece Revisited for turning me on to that. Roger Scruton on beauty. You can't have, you could ask about the left, what's with the weird obsession with being a fat, ugly slob? You kind of prefer zigging when they zag. Why are you so angry? The youth movement on the right has watched for years as the boomers let the country collapse around them. Unrestricted immigration has unmoored traditional happy communities. Stagnant wages. Aristotle writes about this in The Politics, by the way, a book I'll be teaching soon. You cannot have unrestricted immigration. You can't just pump your cities full of poor people from foreign places. Okay, that's a very easy way to undo the fabric of your political community. It's no breaking news there. We've known it for thousands of years. Stagnant wages and skyrocketing home prices have made family formation economically difficult. Divorce law and feminist hectoring have undercut traditional long-term marriages. A generation of young men, especially young and talented white men from the middle class, find themselves denied access to the institutions of power. They're too privileged, but are still expected to hitch themselves to the plow of economic productivity and keep the regime functioning. More and more of these young men are checking out. They don't want to die for Joe Biden and gay rights in the Ukraine. They aren't interested in sacrificing for a regime that hates them. Moreover, they suspect that many older conservatives with their comparative financial security are too insulated from the current crisis. Boomers have made it, quote unquote, and will likely not live long enough to suffer the consequences of a financial or political collapse. They've seized the lifeboats and left the young to fend for themselves. Okay, so that was this part of the article, what the boomers need to know about the based. That they don't hate America, that they're mocking the mindless dogmatism of the excesses of cultish fanaticism associated with anti-racism, the authoritative piety of our time, that they're zigging against the leftist zag away from fat, slow, and stupid towards fit, smart, and beautiful, or handsome. And they're angry because they are being asked to sacrifice themselves for a regime that hates them. So in a second, I'm going to turn to this, what the based need to know about the boomers. But first, I have a MyPillow commercial. No, I'm just joking. I don't. I just want to pull up the chat, see how everybody's doing there. One comment here in response to my argument about the Heideggerian right. I disagree. Giorgiani, I haven't read everything he's written. I've read some of the things that he's written. We probably have a disagreement over the interpretation of Heidegger and over what Heidegger might mean for the right. But for sure, he's somebody who's trying to think through some theoretical alternatives on the dissident right. So there may be things he's written that are worth reading. I thought his book on Prometheism, I think it's called Prometheism, is worth a look for sure. Matthew says, Michael, America has always been a liberal project. Frankly, there's some deep soul searching to do to figure out what actually can be recovered. Yeah, and by the way, this is not soul searching that started yesterday. Leo Strauss recognized that all possibilities for rational liberalism have been undermined by Heidegger, and that we need to have a real serious examination of a possible defense of liberalism, given its, you could say, philosophical refutation by Heidegger. Political philosophy as relevant as ever. Just going over to the chat again, seeing here. Yeah, okay. Again, thanks for being here. Nice to see familiar friends and faces. What the based need to know about the boomers. Why are you so complacent? So now we're imagining questions that the young dissident right is asking Bill Kristol and the National Review. Why are you so complacent? Well, the older generation doesn't see itself as complacent, of course. The young are correct to despise clown world. Clown world, okay, lack of seriousness, everything its opposite. Everybody having a gay old time, but nothing decent about it. But boomers see them as petulant and self-pitying when they insist that the United States today is worse in every possible way compared to anything that has ever existed. That's melodramatic and unhelpful. So the boomer Republicans, the boomer right says, you never have experienced a world that's actually coming apart at the seams. So take it easy. Don't be so melodramatic. And boomers aren't in fact complacent. Walk into any county Republican Party meeting and it will be filled with high energy members of the 65 and up crowd eager to save their country. The problem for the young is their focus. Boomers still believe in the institutions they grew up with. Many believe that if only we pass a balanced budget amendment and term limits or hold an Article 5 constitutional convention, the nation's problems can be solved. They don't seem to appreciate fully how the left has dramatically transformed the country in their lifetimes, whereas the young dissident online right sees this as clearly as can be hoped. Many of these changes have been so dramatic, even shocking, that the older generation simply cannot process what has been done to the land that they love. Mass immigration in particular has radically altered our national character and given the left an enormous electoral advantage. Each year, the nation's cities become more and more alienated from its suburbs and rural heartland. That's not the kind of political problem that can be solved with a few pieces of legislation and imploring calls to treat each other with respect and decency. You could say, restating this in terms of Aristotelian political science, it's not a matter of the laws, it's a matter of the regime. The constitution of the regime has changed, and the boomer right is still treating it like it's a legal problem rather than a more comprehensive political problem. Anyway, back to the text. The boomers point out that as bad as the riots of 2020 were, and they clearly were not the peaceful protests described by the state media, Americans who lived through the 1960s witnessed far more and far more violent radicalism than anything that has happened yet in contemporary America. The 60s included widespread fires and bombings on campuses, occupations by armed radicals, gun battles erupting in courtrooms, political kidnappings, and assassinations. And I add, we're not there yet, and hopefully we won't get there, but you can see from the point of view of an older conservative why a younger conservative might be overstating the case for our for the state that we're in. Has anyone been assassinated? But then on the other hand, people did in the Black Lives Matters protests. There were people who were killed in the January 6th uprising or event. There were people on the side of the protesters who were killed. And so here too, maybe the boomers are understating the case, over exaggerating the violent radicalism of the 60s and under evaluating the violent radicalism of our time. But still, let's go on with their case. As if that were not enough, the next decade was even worse in some ways with its urban decay, crime, filth, and stagflation of the 1970s, not to mention the self-humiliation of Jimmy Carter's foreign policy. Well, come on. We also see a humiliating foreign policy in more recent times, do we not? What's happening today is in certain ways not new for the boomers, yet America came through all that and even won the Cold War. And living through the Cold War itself, especially at its height, is another experience that the base can't quite relate to, which makes today's crisis seem less like an existential threat. These are also good points. I mean, the younger generation hasn't lived through some of what the older generation has seen. It can't relate to the perspective of the older generation on what seems so pressing for the young dissident right may seem to a certain extent like old news for the older right and like a watered down version or a less important or less intense version of it. But there's no getting around that difference, you might think. And yet, the whole point of the article is to address this generation gap on the right. So maybe the authors think there's a way of getting around this gap besides just stating each side's position. So simply on the basis of their experience, older conservatives are far more likely to have a certain faith that America can turn things around, can rescue herself yet again. That opinion may be wrong or misguided, but it's not automatic proof of moral cowardice or bad faith. Another question the dissident right might have for the boomer right: why did you fail so miserably to strangle the infant wokeism in its crib and hand us this crappy society we have today? If boomers are going to be accused of living forever in the 1980s, they might respond to this charge with a line from the classic 80s movie Stripes, "Lighten up, Francis." More seriously, the older generation can say with much validity that they didn't create this mess we're in. Its intellectual origins can be traced back to the importation of German political science in the late 1800s. Ronald Reagan and even Richard Nixon campaigned against the liberal establishment that was already well entrenched. So the failures of the conservative resistance to stop encroaching leftism can't be pinned entirely on George Will or anyone else alive today. Long before Reagan and William F. Buckley waged their own unsuccessful battle against political correctness, conservatives like Robert Taft and Albert J. Nock failed to overturn FDR's New Deal. Going back even further, Elihu Root and Henry Cabot Lodge were unable to stop the progressive movement. There's plenty of blame to go around for our present predicament. What all these old fogies living and dead can legitimately say is that absent the resistance that was mounted, America's decline would have happened even faster. Of course, a failure to solve problems is one thing, and the boomers may have a reasonable defense there. A failure to see problems, however, is less excusable. The inability or unwillingness to acknowledge how radically the country has changed and to accept, however hard this may be, that no simple remedies or accommodation within the current system seem possible is the source of the younger generation's greatest impatience and frustration. So in that part of the article, we had accusations, or let's say questions, posed by the dissident young right to the boomer right about their complacency, about their failure to strangle the infant wokeism in its crib. And now we're going to see how there could be a combination of the experience of the boomers and the energy of the based. Let me pause again here briefly. Thank you all for being here. Hope you find this interesting. We're reading from AmericanMind.org. Let's continue. Combining experience and energy. There are plenty of lost boomers clinging to the dream of a dying past, and far too many cynical young radicals too black-pilled to take useful action. But the solution isn't intergenerational finger-pointing. What's needed is a return to a united front politics that merges boomer resources with youthful talent and energy. Well, this right here, I definitely can stand behind. There's a lot of youthful talent. There's a lot of youthful energy. And what the youth lack to put behind their talent and their energy are resources. And on the other hand, there are a lot of boomers with resources, but wouldn't want to say without talent and energy, but let's say they're spending their resources in the wrong place. They're supporting institutions that have lost their vitality and their reason for existing. And so there's a match to be made here, a heavenly match to be made. A united front that merges boomer resources with youthful talent and energy. And for that, the right needs another leader like Trump, or perhaps even Trump himself, to return to the potent politics of national renewal that won in 2016. This right-wing youth movement has skepticism of the regime in spades. What it needs is a way to focus this energy towards accomplishing some great end. Trump was the flash of lightning that gave a jolt of energy and life to the moribund conservative movement. Young men who were drowning in cynicism and boredom found in Trump a leader who could inspire them. The meme war waged on Trump's behalf by his mischievous and youthful followers made an enormous difference in the election. Here we see a model of the kind of alliance between the boomers and the based that the right needs as it struggles against the schoolmarm dictatorship. The youth movement on the right shouldn't jettison the boomers as out-of-touch losers. It's imperative that the members and pranksters that make up the vanguard of the new right find a way to connect their searing cultural commentary and humor to older Americans. It's been done before, especially in 2015, and it can be done again. Let me just say here, this is a bit of a stretch, but not so much of a stretch that it's not relevant or outlandish. Leo Strauss, if you read his essay or the record of the remarks he gave under the title German Nihilism, very crucially sets out the possible relationship between the nihilistic, right? That's the way that he characterizes it in that essay. And in academia at least, the old-fashioned professors who can address the genuine and legitimate outrage and intuitions of the young German nihilists or of the young nihilistic based right. He provides us with the best kind of analysis and understanding in academic terms, not even in academic terms, but the relationship between old-fashioned professors and intelligent youth with nihilistic urges in that German nihilism essay. But what he does not mention, in quite the same way, he does mention the politics of it, because he talks about Churchill, for example. But we have additional challenges today in terms of redirecting resources, institution building, supporting new publications like I Am 1776, American Mind, New Founding, and everybody who's trying to connect here resources with talent. But if you want to see a brilliant analysis of how that plays out from Strauss's perspective, have a look at his essay on German nihilism. But let's go back here. The youth movement shouldn't jettison the boomers as out of touch. It's imperative that the members and pranksters find a way to connect their searing cultural commentary and humor to older Americans. Yeah, it's been done before, especially in 2015. It can be done again. Our message to the young: stay away from intergenerational blame games. Many older Americans simply didn't understand what was happening to their country as they grew up. Their 401ks were growing. They could still grill in peace. Life was good. That things have deteriorated so quickly and in almost every way is still very difficult for this generation to process. Another way of stating this here: don't fight the right. Whether they're boomer or based, don't fight the right. Don't put your blame there. Message to the young. To the boomers: understand that the youthful right-wing provocateurs have a place, very important place. If you want a better country for you and your children, you need those who can use humor and mockery to disarm the left. Mockery is an extremely powerful political tool. Humor is an extremely powerful political tool. And you know that the left is waging a war on humor. Anyway, boomers, you need those who can use humor and mockery to disarm the left. Facts and logic will not save America. And these other things that were mentioned earlier, right? The tax cuts and those kinds of policies, that's not going to do it. Those kinds of technical adjustments. A spiritual war against the high priests of wokeness can. In other words, this is a battle in the realm of political theology, not just in the realm of policy and technique. For that, conservatives need to do more than just throw policy papers at their enemies. If winning policy debates was enough, then Washington would not be the leftist leviathan it is now. Older Americans should embrace, or at least learn to appreciate, the joys of trolling the ever-living daylights out of woke communists and liberals. You can say that Bronze Age Pervert, for example, is a theological political treatise. You don't have theological political treatises being produced by the boomers, and yet it's such a crucial and essential part of political and spiritual warfare, not to mention political philosophy. These digital jujitsu maneuvers can effectively leverage big tech's massive weight against its sanctimonious overlords and undermine their ideological pretensions. Both older and younger citizens on the right agree on the alarming power of Silicon Valley and the way it distorts our political life and public discourse. By the way, another thing here, didn't come out quite so clearly here, although you see it sort of in the background. The based right know more about the realm of digital jujitsu maneuvers, about the realm of the digital, about the digital technologies, the new the currency side of the question, okay, the cryptocurrencies and all of that. If you've ever tried to see a young guy being questioned in the Senate by a boomer, you see that there's a huge gap in technical knowledge and technical understanding that concerns not like the technical side of policymaking, but these new technologies that can be used very powerfully to shape political life and public discourse. So it's just something else that the boomers can learn from the based. The young and the old must join forces for the good of the country. Experience and energy, the boomers and the based, must stand together in defense of freedom and against our degenerate ruling class. So you should definitely say in the chat and in the comments what you think about this proposal, offered to us by Glenn Elmers and Josiah Lippincott, who are respectively a senior fellow of the Claremont Institute and a former Marine officer and current student at the Van Andel School of Statesmanship at Hillsdale College. This was published in The American Mind, americanmind.org, and it is dated January 31st, 2022. Boomers meet the based. Important proposal. I think we'll stop there. I had planned to read as well. This integralist argument is wrong, even if you're Catholic. Published discoursemagazine.com, January 27th. But Kevin Augustine, do we have time for it? Let's see. I'll probably hold off. Do another stream later in the day. So thank you, those of you who are here, spending your morning with me. I appreciate it. Matthew, let me actually, it's misleading that I have this article up on screen, but okay, fine. This idea of allying with boomers is ridiculous. We aren't liberals. Boomers are. We have nothing in common except a common enemy. It's not a generation gap. I'm 40, by the way, married, kids, and good job. Okay, so what do you guys think about Matthew's position here, that the idea of allying with boomers is ridiculous? They're liberals, so it's kind of like the distinction between liberal conservatism. So it's not the generation gap between the boomers and the based, or that's not what's fundamental. What's fundamental is that it's liberal conservatism among the boomers and non-liberal conservatism among the based, and therefore no possible common ground. It's like you guys have seen Yoram Hazony's National Conservatism Conference. That's sort of the largely representing the boomer side of the equation and seemingly incompatible with based dissident right. Okay, Matthew, you may be right. I'm curious to know what other people think. My pleasure. My pleasure. Great to spend time with everybody and to go over these articles. A lot of thoughtful commentators giving us some things to think about. Okay, well, boomers in the based, that was one article. The Freedom Convoy, that was another one. So do put your comments in the comment box, share, like, subscribe, and all of that. You know, I have courses on Heidegger, Strauss, Plato, Schmidt, Dugan, and others at millermanschool.com. You can have a look at. Thanks for spending your morning. Hope you guys like this, and see you later. Bye. Have a great day.